We're going to talk about this recent uptick in U.S. inflation, and so why what's going on. And one of the things I'll show you here in a second is most advanced countries have seen an increase in inflation. This isn't a U.S. thing. Most countries have seen empty shelves. This isn't a U.S. thing, so we can't just say it's just incompetence of some policymaker in the U.S. caused this, because everybody else is experiencing that. But inflation came in February at 7.9% over the last year. They'll announce March here next week, and that's the highest since, as I note there on the slide, since January 1982. That would be the overall inflation rate. I should note there's some other inflation rates. One thing I'll notice is that this series of inflation doesn't have to be, but this series of inflation has hit low-income households more. They tend to buy the products whose prices have gone up the most. For example, gasoline or something like that. And so they're experiencing more inflation than, say, the average household is. If you were to look at, that's also reflected in what's called the wage and clerical worker consumer price index, and it's running at about 8.6% per year. Then if you're asking about senior citizens, typically people say, well, inflation's really hard on people with fixed incomes and so forth, and it certainly is. However, the good news is that that inflation rate's only about 7.4%. Actually, it's lower than the overall inflation rate. And the main reason is that they buy a lot of medical care, and medical care costs have gone up less than the overall inflation rate. So actually, seniors are getting a little bit of a bargain in terms of who's being hit by inflation. Going back historically in the US, the inflation rate today is 7.9%, as I said, the highest since January 1982. In that spell, the late 1970s, early 1980s inflation, that peaked at 14.6%, about almost double of what it is today. If you want to go way back in history, is where we have reasonable statistics dating back to the early 1900s. We had this crazy stretch coming out of World War I, where inflation was really, really high due to the war, armament process and arming and so forth, and the demand for food worldwide. And it peaked at 24% in 1920. That was also the Spanish flu period, but probably more due to the war. And then there was a total collapse in what they called then the Great Depression. They called it the Great Depression then, not realizing there's going to be one even bigger. Inflation actually is running at minus 18% per year in May 1921. It just totally collapsed within a year. To give a little bit more context to this, here, let me switch slides here. This shows our inflation rate going back to 2019. So I want to give you a feel for pre-COVID. This gray bar is when COVID took effect, and it was running at around 2%, just over 2%, which has really been the inflation rate in the US for, dating back to the mid-1990s. That's been the common inflation rate. Then we had the great fall in the spring of 2020 during the shutdown, where commodity prices particularly fell, but other prices fell as well. And we see here the all items, which includes energy and food prices, really fell. And the all items here in orange didn't fall as much. I'm sorry, the items without food and energy, what they call the core, what the Federal Reserve more looks at, because they think food and oil prices are so volatile. And if you look at that since then, though, beginning at January 2021, inflation really started to take off. And as I will talk later, one of the things that seemed to have happened around October last year is that inflation became more general across the entire economy. Before October, it was, prices were rising, but it was concentrated in gasoline prices, or the price of used cars and trucks, or the price of new cars and so forth. It was really isolated. And since then, it's become more general throughout the economy. And as I'll talk about here in a minute, that makes it a much bigger problem. It's something that you need to begin to worry about. Then the other feature that any armchair economists, everything from my mother-in-law to anybody else, they note they'll look at the price of gasoline. It's the one price that's widely available when you're driving down the street. And this shows that the price of gasoline is slightly higher than what it was in July 2008. But once you adjust for inflation, was a little over $1 more a gallon then. So gasoline prices are high. They really went up, in the context of the economy recovered worldwide and the price of oil got bid up. However, we've had it worse in terms of the price of gasoline prior to the Great Recession. This shows what I was getting at, the worldwide phenomenon. And I apologize. I know this is a busy graph. And one of the things I'll tell you is the economists like to get data off of this website, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, because it's really easy to work with. One of the problems, though, with it is it doesn't let you control like the size of the font or anything like that. But it does give you graphs right away. So the blue here is U.S. inflation. The blue is U.S. inflation. And these other colors, such as orange is what it is for Italy, and red is what it is for Canada, and purple is what it is for Germany, and so forth. And what you see is all of us had this general rise in inflation, where beginning in the early fall, late summer, the U.S. had this acceleration. Now, to be fair to the U.S., these international comparisons tend to overstate the gap, and the reason why is that if the energy is taxed at a much higher rate in Europe. So, for example, if the price of gasoline is $1 a gallon and it doubles to $2 a gallon, that's 100% inflation. We don't have a lot of taxes on gasoline, so all of it's just passed straight through. In Europe, if you have a price of a gallon's $1 and you have $2 in taxes, that makes it $3, and it goes up another $1 to $4, raised $1 like the U.S., that would only be 33% inflation. So the fact that they have high taxes makes it appear as though their inflation rates are lower, but nonetheless, the U.S. has experienced more of an acceleration in inflation than other countries have. So why has inflation reared its ugly head? And why is, well, first I want to define, before I talk about the whys, is what is inflation? And inflation is the rate at which the value of a currency is falling. And consequently, and here's the key word that I want to emphasize, the general level of prices are rising. So it's normally not a problem like we had. So the Biden administration, the Fed, in the first 9-10 months of last year, oh, inflation's not a problem. I know it's, I know people are paying more for certain things, but it's not a big problem because it's only these isolated items. And once those, the market for oil and the market for used cars get straightened out, everything's going to be okay. And what I told you is then beginning in the fall, that became much more generalized, meaning, no, it's now something that has to be addressed by policy or should be addressed by policy. So what is why? And then I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So one is the supply chain breakdown that we hear so much about. And in fact, I remember, I think it was Ian invited me to do one of these webinars for COVID in the spring of 2020. And then I said, the biggest problem that we'll face is on the supply chain side, because they're going to be totally ripped apart. They're going to have to be put back together. Now, I don't want to say, I was correct about that statement. I don't want to say I was, knew how exactly it manifests itself in all its ways, but the supply chain was something at least I was worried about. Inflation, as I already said, became more systematic. I want to talk about that, why that mattered, not why that really means it's more important. The Federal Reserve was probably too cautious in addressing inflation late last year. So their problem, as I'll talk about, is they wanted to avoid past mistakes, where in the past, say 30 some years, the Fed's been too prone to stop, slow down the economy, raise interest rates. And they wanted to avoid that mistake. And they probably were a little bit too cautious, as I'll talk about. Then I'm going to talk about Trump-Biden administration policy errors that have exacerbated this. Most of them will be policies that were unwise, is a nice way of saying it, done by the Trump administration. And even though during the campaign, Joe Biden said that they were not very good policy, he's maintained them. He's doubled down on them, and they've played a role, as I'll talk about. And the other one is the Great Resignation. That's a possible one. In the end, I'm going to argue that in terms of inflation, that's actually more of a lagging indicator than one that's the causal factor. And then one I won't even, I'll mention, but it's not even showing up in the official data yet outside of the price of gasoline. And that's Russia's so-called special operation in Ukraine, which of course is going to has affected energy prices and will definitely have, probably will have large effects on food prices, especially in the developing world. So first, why is inflation surged? Why is it surged? One is global supply chains, as I said, are disrupted. And as I think somebody once said in a song, you feel like you're back in the USSR, where as an economist, I tell my stories to students about how when you don't have a market economy, like the Soviet Union, you tend to have things like empty grocery stores. But this is a worldwide phenomenon. The U.S. certainly. These are all recent pictures. These aren't from 2020 when toilet paper was the rage. The United Kingdom, as my colleague who introduced me, Ian Sheldon, can confirm the UK has had even more supply disruptions in one of their policy errors, Brexit, which has really disrupted their supply chain even beyond COVID. Then Canada. You could go to Hong Kong, that's from early March. Spain, that was from a few weeks ago. Shanghai, that was actually, I believe that was this week that picture was taken. And what I'm saying is these supply disruptions and empty shelves are found throughout the world. And I will mention about Spain. Spain's one of the countries within the European Union, inflation's been a little lower than the US. However, within Spain itself, they've actually experienced a little bit higher inflation than we have. And one of the reasons why I note is, again, that comes back, you just can't just say some one person, some idiot in the United States caused this problem and we should hate him, which is, no, everybody's facing it. Everybody didn't use the same policies. There's a lot of different policies. Everybody's experiencing it. And I just couldn't help myself. There's in the last 5 years of the USSR communism, it was even probably the worst. And that would be, look at that high quality Moscow grocery store in 1990. It definitely pretty sparsely in terms of food there. So why the supply chain collapse? And I think the way to summarize it is that business practices and then government regulation to a lesser role was basically set up for plan for the best and hope for the best. It was basically nothing could go wrong, and that's all we're going to think about. And as I'll talk about transportation in a little bit more detail, when transportation's messed up with modern manufacturing, the last 30 some years of just-in-time manufacturing inventory, where you don't want to sit on inventory of spare parts for long, and the other feature in the last 30 some years is the fragmentation of the supply chain, where if you look at, say, manufacturing in the Midwest, circa 1990, the inputs either were vertically in the company, they made them themselves, or they tend to purchase them nearby. They weren't, coming from China or from all over. And of course, now you have one item coming from China, another item from Vietnam, another item from Toledo. It's very fragmented all over. And if one place falls apart, whether it's a typhoon, like in Japan in 2012, or COVID, the whole thing falls apart. In terms of like paint, you can imagine there's something like 40 ingredients that go into paint. And if one glitch, one ingredient, you don't have the paint. Unfortunately, at first, people were optimistic, say, late 2020, that this was going to clear up. And now it's becoming more apparent that it's probably these supply chain issues, though will probably get better, will still be troublesome. So what does that do? What does that say about inflation? Well, we'll get to that here in a second. But first, we have to talk about how the supply chain, just briefly, since I'm sure many of you already know this. When the COVID pandemic broke out around the world, there was a lot of stimulus. People had money. They weren't working. They were locked down. So they bought office furniture. They bought a big TV. And they bought consumer durable goods. And there was a massive shift away from services such as going to the theater or to the restaurant to buying durable goods, which meant the whole worldwide supply chain became exceedingly stressed in early 2020 with this big shift in demand, which, it will get less and less as people go back to regular shopping patterns. But right now, it's still leaning to consumer durables. And so this meant there had to be a restructuring, like especially in China, you had factories making this or businesses doing that. And it is not like magically, if a firm lays off workers in Shenzhen because nobody's demanding that particular product, they're not going to show up in Tianjin, another city, automatically. It's going to take time to reshuffle the labor market, whether it's China or the US or what have you. And China, even though China has some advantages about in their labor market, they have this floating workforce that just moves around. It didn't automatically adjust. And then simultaneously, the shipping companies said when COVID hit, we're just going to shut down most of it. There's going to be no international trade. We're just going to shut it down. Where instead what happened was consumers are saying, we actually want more. We want these big TV sets. And so the first feature that happened is these consumer durables that now have to be shipped, unlike a restaurant or a personal service. The ports in China and Asia and in the United States were overwhelmed. They were just overwhelmed with volume. So it wasn't just like US ports, it was in China. They were a mess too. And so pre-COVID, it would cost approximately $2,000 to ship a shipping container across the Pacific. By last Christmas time, in that run up before Christmas, it was getting to $25,000 or even more. The New York Times had a story about someone who had to pay, by the time they were done, it must have been way into the 30s to get their product. So right there, you have this increase in transportation costs. And so it's enough to actually start mattering. When you get a tenfold increase in transportation costs, even though transportation might be only 7% of the cost of our average product or average durable good, if we get a tenfold increase, even though it's a small share, that's going to start mattering in terms of costs. And the other feature that happened with this container that made it even why it's such a mess is that all the demand came from places like China or Korea or so forth, making the consumer durables. The containers would be filled up with TV sets, come back to the United States. The typical model then is fill them back up and ship them back to Asia because you don't want to lose money hauling back empty containers. Well, it wasn't going the other way to Asia. So in US ports, the containers were just piling up because they weren't shipping them back to China. And so that created another mess. There's this massive shortage of containers where they were needed. The good news, though, on this, though, where I will give the Biden administration some credit, is they intervened in an area. There's limited areas they could do on the supply chain, not much. And one of the areas they did do was they worked with the labor unions on the West Coast in particular at the ports to get those ports open 24 hours a day. So they deserve credit there for at least our ports now are not the mess they were, say, 6 months ago. Right now, this is supposedly B&R Exports, supposedly one of the major export companies, and they're saying, I told you 2,000 pre-COVID was the price. They're saying about 8,500 now for a 20-foot container to go to the West Coast. and a little bit more if you want to go to the East Coast. So it's still more than fourfold more than pre-COVID, but it is coming down. So that part is starting to get better. But another problem that arose is the so-called truck driver shortage. And being an economist, when we hear the word shortage, we kind of raise our radar. Are you sure that's a shortage, or is that something you don't want to pay for? So, for example, if a new Mercedes costs $100,000 and I want to pay $20,000, I could, there's a shortage of Mercedes. I'm willing to pay $20,000 and nobody will sell me one. Well, sometimes when people talk about worker shortages, it's the same kind of issue. For example, for truck drivers, the average truck driver made almost $39,000 in 1980. If you adjust for inflation, not even all the way up by how much wages rose, but only by inflation, that would be $132,000 today is what a truck driver would make. If you look at the current data, the truck drivers are making on average around $61,000. So in other words, they're making only with inflation, they're making less than half of what they made in 1980. And truck driving is not the most pleasant occupation, and it's going to take money to attract truckers. So what I'm saying is a lot of this is, the real wage of truckers went down. Obviously, people want to do other things in response, and that's the reason why there's a trucking shortage. But that meant, though, trucks really important, though, to get the product once it gets to the port, either to the railroad or to the final destination, or back when the railroad is like it comes in their global rail yard in Chicago, to then take it from Chicago to somewhere here in the Midwest. Well, that meant, okay, that wasn't happening. So we're now getting things into the port, but we're still having problems with trucking. A next one was railroads play a big role in certain kinds of consumer durables and durables in general. And they were overwhelmed by short staff. They didn't have the staff to do it. But a lot of that was their own doing. They created that problem by, again, hoping for the best and planning for the best. Here is rail employment going back to 1980. And what you see is, it was 550,000 in 1980, and today it's just over 100,000. And in fact, if you're to look at it between 2018 and 2021, it actually fell another 40,000. They're just shedding workers as fast as they could. And so basically say, hey, we got this automation, it's going to work great, everything's going to be wonderful. And one goes through the supply chain stories, it's been a disaster. The railroads have just not come through. Some of that is on the regulatory side, where you can blame presidents from Reagan through Trump of not requiring the railroads to be ready to provide an adequate level of service, because this is not the first time the railroads have had problems. People in agriculture can tell all sorts of stories of the railroads having issues. So that's one issue. I will come back just briefly. I'll just know, well, why are the shelves empty again? And that apparently is four things that came about. And I'll mention one of them is the COVID itself. Retailers were claiming that they had many more worker absentees from recent COVID, from Omicron, than they did from the original COVID. And so they actually had more of a worker shortage just from the illness and COVID itself. I mean, you got to do more cleaning and all that stuff. It made it really tough for them just to get basic things onto the shelves. Then you had, as I already mentioned, the truckers and the railroads playing a role. And the final feature being is it's just that at this time, we had, along with COVID, a lot of other disruptions that just made things really complicated. I already mentioned Brexit. I'll talk a little bit about the Ukraine, and another one is we'll talk about tariffs. Okay, so now I want to say, okay, we got inflation. Supply chain played a role, but obviously not the full role. I mean, if it's getting better, but inflation's getting worse today, that's saying other things are at work. The big problem there is probably the Fed. They probably should have been more aggressively ending their quantitative easing. So when COVID hit, they got into the mortgage secondary market and bought up mortgages, trying to keep interest rates, long-term interest rates low. The municipal bond markets, where they actually probably saved those markets, they were about ready to collapse in March 2020. But they continued doing it, and because they didn't want to make the same mistake of cutting off money too quickly. But when inflation kept going up and up and up, they definitely in hindsight. But I'm just saying, even in foresight, they should have seen them maybe at least get rid of this quantitative easing. And it was only until their last meeting that they actually, barely raised the discount rate. So they've been maybe more timid than what you would want, though I understand why they had some of their concerns, because they've been too aggressive in the past. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and it's a lot of lines. The green line is the actual inflation rate. And the core, where you get rid of energy and food, is the purple. The blue and the orange is what I want to talk about. The blue line is, if you look at inflation, which I'll talk about here more in a second, it's usually caused, if we go back to the last 30 years, usually caused by just a small group of commodities or products that have really high inflation. And the other part of the economy, most of the economy doesn't have any inflation. And so it's usually very concentrated. So what this blue line is called is what they call the trimmed. So what they take out, they calculate the inflation rate after you take out the 8% with the lowest inflation, 8% of your expenditures that have prices rising or falling the most. And they take out the 8% where prices are most rising. In other words, they take out the outliers, which is already, as I said, that accounts for the biggest movement in inflation. And so now it's picking up, well, what's left is if you start seeing an upward trend, that means overall inflation's not just concentrated, it's a general phenomena. And that's what you see right here, the blue line ticking up, coming up, saying this is getting more and more widespread. It isn't just used cars anymore. And this would be a similar one, what they call the median, which is they look at what's the inflation rate at the middle of your expenditures. They line up all the categories, everything you could spend your money on, from low with the ones with the fastest falling prices to the ones with the fastest rising prices, right at the middle where you're spending 50% of your income. What is the inflation rate there? Well, that right now is 4.6, the median, but you see it's been rising. The point is it's widespread now. It's gotten out. And this just shows my point. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. So going back to 1995, so I was talking about inflation's average just under 2%. What this column shows, since 1995, if you look at the 5% of your expenditures with the fastest inflation, the 5% with the fastest inflation, that accounted for 176% of inflation since 1995 on average. In other words, just that 5% was more than the rest of the economy had falling prices. So typically, like I said, since inflation's concentrated in a real small part. And then what this shows, if it's above 2%, it's concentrated in 64%. 64% of the inflation is in the fastest 5% of your expenditures rising with rising prices. And what you see here is what's been happening recently. And it shows it's falling and falling and falling to here in January 21, or by then it was only 29% of inflation was in the fastest 5%. My point is it's even a year ago it was getting more and more general that it's not a just wait for used cars again. Okay, this shows a little bit of that. This is just broad categories. But what I want you to notice is that the green here is used car trucks. And that, they had a lot of inflation. And that's a spillover from the supply chain where, reading the newspaper, people know that new car production's down because they can't get transistors, semiconductors, and used car. So there's a shortage of new cars and higher prices. And so people are buying used cars, and they went crazy. This is energy is right here. Again, energy prices have really soared. This includes all, like utilities, electricity and so forth, along with, say, gasoline or diesel. This is new vehicles. They've had, like I said, pretty high inflation for a good like that. And then finally, here is, things for like food, food's kind of been slowly ticking up and will probably go up. But notice, like I was going back to the senior citizens, usually as you can go back all the way to the 70s, 1970s, medical care was typically one of the fastest growing components. And right now, it's one of the good news for inflation, and why I was noting that seniors are actually facing a smaller problem than what the rest of the population's facing. Okay, so why did the Fed make these mistakes? Well, one is kind of bad luck. They had no history of dealing with supply chains. So on one hand, we could say, well, okay, they didn't want to make the same mistake as before, and they never seen a supply chain issue like this, this globalized one. The other is what I'll call deeply flawed Trump administration policies continued by the Biden administration. And I was talking to someone, who should get most of the blame for that? Is it Trump who started the not so brilliant policy, or is it Biden for continuing the policy that's obviously not working? And I'll talk about that. And then one I won't talk much about, though it receives a lot of attention, but I will mention it. It might have some credibility in a limited way, and that is corporations raising prices, trying to take advantage of the situation. And so I just want to note that among economists, that's a really controversial thing, in the sense that it's controversial, but to me, it's a semantics issue. They're arguing about semantics. That is, the first argument is, well, if companies always could make more profits, why weren't they doing so in the past? Well, I think the answer to that, to me, seems relatively easy, is that COVID shifted the demand structure, demand curves, and they're now adjusting to that. Then the next point is that, well, corporations can only do that once. They can't just keep raising prices. They'll start eventually losing all their business. So it's not a long-term thing that keeps inflation going. That part is true. However, if it is true that the demand curve shifted and they're just raising prices to take advantage of that, then part of this recent jump could very well be these corporations taking advantage, because if you go look at corporate profits, they've been dramatically higher. If you listen to their statements when they talk to market analysts, when the CEO will talk to stock market analysts, they'll talk about, well, we have a lot of pricing power and we want to maintain it. They're outright saying they're doing, they're saying they're doing this. So like I said, it's controversial in the sense that, well, it's not going to continuously happen, but as a one-time thing that got inflation started, it very well could be. And certainly, given the kind of a general statement about the Biden administration of, very reactive, slow, lethargic, don't want to make decisions, and the Justice Department probably being the primary, one of the primary places, these corporations don't have a lot of fear of any kind of antitrust action, because they're moving at the Justice Department at a glacial pace. So let's talk about to me, the biggest policy era, the Biden era, and this is that he said during the campaign that the Trump trade war wasn't a good idea, and almost virtually every economist would agree with that. And this just lists the amount of goods that faced high tariffs coming into the United States due to the Trump tariffs. So these are the special Trump tariffs, and they're about $610 billion facing tariffs. There's been some exceptions made where actually the Biden administration's granted fewer than the Trump administration, and very slowly, I might add. But a large share, $600 billion of imports, that's a large share of our imports, have faced these tariffs up to 25%. And so this comes from, as I noted earlier, from the Peterson Institute. They're probably the most respected on international trade issues policy institute in Washington. And they went through, they have this general equilibrium economic model. And what they found is if you eliminate the Trump tariffs, whether made for weak national security reasons or by saying that, oh, China's unfair or something, right away, we would get about a 1.3% reduction in the CPI. Prices would fall about 1.3%. And why that's important is that one of the reasons why inflation gets going is that if people start expecting inflation, then they'll start making decisions based on inflation. For example, workers will want higher wages. People will buy things quickly because they're afraid the price will go up. People will start getting inflation affecting behavior. And so if we can stop that mindset that it's going to go faster and faster, it'll make it a lot easier for the Federal Reserve to bring it down. So that's the first, major policy error that I want to mention is keeping these tariffs was not a very wise move. I mean, it's totally for politics. We can't show we're weak on China when unfortunately our economy has become very dependent upon it. And perhaps there were better ways of dealing with certain kinds of workers struggling than trying to indirectly do that with a trade war that's generally hurt American consumers. Also, I want to note, if you're to go through this, one of the features about the Trump tariffs that made them particularly, frankly, boneheaded is that they were, if you want to do a trade war, economists don't say don't do it, but if you want to do one, you should put it on the final product, like on completed televisions, completed automobiles, completed washers and dryers. You don't put it on the inputs like steel or semiconductors or other inputs, because that raises the cost for your manufacturers, and your tariff made them, where the goal was hoping that you would help them, you made them less competitive in world markets because they have to pay more than other countries' manufacturers have to pay for inputs. So the tariffs were particularly set up in a way that made it were going to cause higher prices and made American manufacturers actually less competitive in many, if not all, cases. Then coming to the next one, and I'll be real brief here, is the labor shortage and so-called labor shortage. And again, my caveat is that one of the things, if you look at the data, the share of US income, GDP, going to wages and benefits has been falling very steadily since the late 1960s. In other words, workers are getting less and less and less and less. That just stands out in the data. That's just a fact. And so the fact that workers may be saying, I don't want to work for less and less real money, shouldn't be a major surprise, given that's been going on for 50 years. Then we had pandemic relief programs where actually we were paying people $600 a week. And a lot of people thought we were paying them to stay home. And in fact, that led to a lot of, especially Republican governors, ending the pandemic unemployment relief program early. And what we found, economists right away jumped on that. Did that matter? Because it's really easy. That's an easy thing to look at, because the states that cut off unemployment insurance, if this is something that's paying people to stay home, you should see their employment going up real fast because they're now have to work. And that did not happen. That didn't happen at all. There's just, it's remarkable how there was almost no effect on average. And actually, it'd be even kind of surprising. Economists thought that argument was being made too strong about being paid to work at home, but we didn't think there was going to be no effect. Then you have the Great Resignation, where definitely quit rates are at very high. where people are switching jobs. And some, take this job and shove it. It's all consistent with my workers are mad kind of thing. Yes, that there seems to be some merit to that. However, some of that, though, is the restructuring in the economy that I was talking about. If the economy, because of COVID, restructured to more sectors, that means we need people to quit and move to other jobs. Moving to the industries that are growing and leaving the industries that are shrinking. So some of that was, a lot of that was necessary for productivity. It might increase costs, but we had to have that reallocation to the growing sectors. But I don't think that's a permanent feature. I think this is going to go away in the sense that what structural thing has made workers more powerful? Well, one of it is, I'll mention, some people have disappeared from the workforce, but there's nothing like unions aren't more powerful. The declining share of union membership, the minimum wage continues to fall. If you just apply Lyndon Johnson's minimum wage of February 1968, it would be over $13 an hour today after inflation. And versus 725. Just in general, step thing by thing, worker bargaining power hasn't gone up. And so I don't think that this great resignation is going to continue for long because of that. Women were especially hit by COVID, especially with childcare, and that is easing, so I'll talk about. But one is the effect on older workers. There seems to be a little bit more effect on older workers. And one is that they were laid off. If they're laid off, they always have a difficult time finding a job anyway. And older people would have more fear of COVID, so they'd be more reluctant anyhow. And also a phenomena that's increasingly in the last few weeks being talked about more is long COVID. And that is 10 to 30%, 10% if you're vaccinated, 30% if you're not, tend to get long COVID. And it's apparently was like a problem with the Spanish flu. They called it sleepy disease. It's been a problem like with the Hong Kong flu, major influenza outbreaks that were serious, had this where COVID being maybe the most severe. And so that might be one of the costs of that. So I will say that the labor market issues, what I want to point out, are why I said they were more of a nuisance, then I'm just about done, Ian, is that here's average wage growth. So it's growing at about 3% per year here in late 2018. And then boom, COVID hit, and it's whoosh, wage growth really rose. That had nothing to do with anything in the economy. It was a composition effect. Remember when COVID hit, who was working? Delivery drivers, frontline workers at grocery stores, relatively low paid. As people were brought back in, they were higher paid, and just by changing the composition, wage growth increased. And so once we get out of that, that compositional effect, wage growth has been more in the range of just under 5%, which means today workers are losing, have lost about 3% of their purchasing power due to inflation. Inflation's near 8. The wages are growing just under 5. That's where I get my 3% number. And so workers are actually getting less than what they were before COVID right now. And so as far as, workers, going back, workers have reasons to be kind of cranky, but also why I said it's a lagging indicator. Well, it's rising slower than inflation. It's not causing it. It's just catching up to inflation. So what I'll finish with then is right now we're missing about 1.3 million men. I don't have time to tell you where I pulled that number from, and about 1.5 million women if we were at, say, February 2020 levels. And it just raises the point that the US immigration policy being very strict. This was not the time. This was probably not the time. 2021 was the slowest population growth in US history. And it means labor force isn't growing. And at a time we would like the labor force to be growing. So I haven't mentioned Russia. I'll just say it hasn't even shown up in the data. In the other features is we don't know when the pain will end. Will Russia run out of money and declare victory and go home? Or will this continue? but certainly, even if it was to end today, there'd be lingering effects in food commodity markets, and probably a little bit so in energy. But it's so hard, it hasn't shown up in the data. We don't know when it'll land. We just know it's not a good thing for this inflation story. And in fact, it might get to the point where it's so inflation gets so high, we raise interest rates to slow that, it could set off a recession, which is now increasingly a fear of economic forecasters. And we'll get rid of the inflation, but at a pretty stiff cost. So on that, I will stop there. And hopefully there's some, looks like we have time for some questions. So Ian, I'll go back to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, for a tour de force of where we are with inflation here in the United States and also in the rest of the world. So let me see, it looks like we have a question in the Q&A. This is from Maureen Cahill. Great presentation. So kudos to you, Mark. Any suggestion on how to move forward? I guess that's a pretty broad question, but I think it's one that you maybe can address.
Yes, Maureen. Well, thank you for the kind words. I think one of this is that, unfortunately, as I said, it's gotten more general. It's now throughout the economy, and that's going to require a slowing down of the economy to kind of crush out. And hopefully, is what they call a soft landing, that they do it just perfectly to get rid of the inflation without setting off a recession. That's going to happen. But what would make it a lot easier is if the Biden administration would get rid of the tariffs. I mean, they're not helping. They're making the situation worse. And as I already said, they were implemented in the least efficient way that you could possibly implement tariffs. And so that would be something that they could do something on. Also, a little bit on the immigration front to address where labor shortages are particularly severe. But the bad news is I don't see any way that we're going to avoid higher interest rates, and in the economic activity that's hit by that is going to have to will suffer.
Okay, well, we have another question here from this is from an anonymous attendee. Traditionally, Americans have paid less for goods and services, food, labor, than the rest of the world. Do we anticipate this inflation boom will change our culture?
I doubt it. Only because, I'm going out there, Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous. However, assuming this doesn't last long, to really change culture is hard. That takes a really persistent effect on people's behavior. And I'll just, kind of remind people of after 9/11, people were saying all these fundamental things would change. There were some things that changed, but there wasn't this massive shift that we expected. Or even more recently, when people thought cities would depopulate because of COVID, that hasn't, we really haven't seen, we saw a little of that, but not anywhere near what we expected. So my answer is probably no, because it won't be persistent enough.
Okay, then we have a question from Stuart Nealis. This is about the connection between what's happening with the CPI and what's happening with house prices. So his question is there any relationship between these factors? I guess those are the factors that you discussed in your presentation, and the housing market, he describes it as madness. Is that inflation related or just speculation and wild departure from fundamentals? And actually,
very well could be.
Mark, can I just follow up? There's a follow-up question from an anonymous attendee. What impact on real estate markets? Mostly interested in residential, but overall real estate markets in general. So those are two connected questions from.
Right. I'll take the first one from the second one first, because it's a little bit easier. Not good. And in fact, as the first question implied, if this is madness, which it seems to have been something that started with exceedingly low interest rates and people getting a lot of cash from the stimulus, bidding up housing prices, that's a potential, if it is, quote, madness, and it does seem to be at least a little frothy in terms of a bubble, that's going to, higher interest rates is going to pop that bubble and cause a drop in residential housing prices. And so if somebody's risk averse, I don't think this would be the time that I would be investing in residential real estate, though I get texts from people who want to buy my house all the time now. In terms of the inflation and housing prices, on one of my slides, I showed you that shelter, and it wasn't a very big part of inflation. And the reason why is a technical adjustment they make about how they use housing costs. And there's two components of a housing costs that are going in there, and one they don't count. So when I buy a house, there's two things. One is I'm buying a house, or essentially buying a property to live in. And the second thing I'm buying is an investment. And so the investment is not really I just made an investment. So to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I said, hey, that's not part of buying a house to live in. That's part of the investment. And we should count that as not part of the cost of living, because you're going to get that back when you sell your house at a much higher price. So when you see these inflation numbers, they don't at all fully reflect large changes in housing prices, because of what they call it. We only want to use the owner equivalent rent. How much of that cost is really due to you want to live in a place? So the answer is no, it's not really showing up in inflation. And two, but just because it's not in the CPI, Consumer Price Index, doesn't mean that it's not something, as we saw in the housing bubble 15 years ago, that it's not important.
Okay, so Mark, we have a question about unionization, but I'm going to jump in as the chair here and sort of piggyback a question with this one. So my question, and I think this question from the audience sort of relates to this, is you touched on this in your presentation, but the one thing that sort of worries macroeconomists is the possibility that these sort of inflation numbers start getting built into people's expectations and wage demands. And it's something that we haven't really seen we have a whole generation of people who've experienced 2% inflation for pretty much their whole lives. And so that's my question. But the question from an audience member, Karima Samadi, is it relates to the unionization at Amazon in Staten Island. And I think there's a broad question in here and I'm sort of adding a little bit to her question, is if we see more workers becoming unionized, is that going to change the way we think about workers' rights and how that affects wages and labor? So I guess I'm tying in the audience members' question with this idea: we're going to go back to a world of wage push inflation if current inflation rates affecting people's expectations.
Well, I'll take the union one first and then your expectation. I don't see a major shift in unions. The Amazon plant, facility in New York and Queens, unionizing was a remarkable event. And I think that was more of a very dynamic organizing effort. The person who organized that is really, in his own way, he's incredibly charming. He relates to people. And I think it was a lot of the function of the individual involved. And the reason why I say that is this US labor law is particularly stacked relative to the other industrial advanced economies, really stacked against unions, that it's easy for firms to do anti-labor violations with very little fine. They can fire workers who want to be part of the union, which is not legal. They get fined 3 years later and told they have to pay back pay or something, which is a tiny trivial penalty for getting rid of the union. And nothing like that is nothing in this that has shifted to really help make unions more ability to bargain. So that's why I continue to see downward levels of unions, at least in the private sector. Right now, it's at levels that we haven't seen in 100 years, if not more, in terms of the share of the labor force in the private sector. In terms of wage expectations, right now, I think I just saw that, like at the University of Michigan asks every month, what do you think inflation will be? And that has creeped above 3%, if I recall. And so it's starting to move. And as you said, if people start getting that expectation that inflation will rise, they'll buy things faster because they're afraid the price will go up, which will stimulate demand, causing inflation. But also, there'll be expectations that, hey, I want a higher wage, or firms will say, we better offer a higher wage because we know that's what our potential workforce is expecting. So right now, it's not an issue. I would say, though, in a year, if we're still at 8-9%, then it's going to be really problematic.
So how does the Fed sort of either, I say restoring credibility is a bit extreme, but how does it maintain its credibility for and damping down expectations about inflation? I mean, do you think the Fed should be moving faster, or are they really worried about the potential for, I like to compare this to the post-Second World War period, where the Federal Reserve probably overreacted to inflation after the war. So what are your thoughts on what the Fed should be doing, or where they might be going?
Well, I'm glad I don't have their job. I think they should, crack down is not the right word, though their first shot out of their cannon was a 0.25% increase in the Fed funds rate, the effect federal bond rates. And that was a pretty, that was like a pop gun. I would have came out with a 0.5%, to say, hey, we're serious. I didn't necessarily say in a year I'd have higher interest rates, but I would have come out a little bit harder right away. Right now, it's, people, there'd be reason to say, wow, 0.25 points all they did. We have 8% inflation. When are they going to, when are they going to get with the program? So I think they need to move fast early and then be willing to lay off quicker.
I mean, I saw today, I think it was the guy who runs the sort of international clearinghouse bank, suggesting central banks need to coordinate their increases in interest rates, because we're potentially entering a new era of global inflation. And with globalization, of course, we get these spillover effects. Anyways, I'm going to finish off with one last question, because we're coming up against our time. We actually have two questions from Alan Lines. I think his second question is way too big to try to answer in a short period of time. Is the world entering a time of deglobalization? I'm gonna just put that one out there for people to think about. But Alan, not surprisingly, asked a question about agricultural commodity prices, and if we go and look at the United Nations FAO food price index, we're now at the highest level of prices we've had since the Arab Spring back in the early 2010s. And over a year ago, we were starting to get food price inflation, largely pandemic driven. And of course, because of things like fertilizer prices, et cetera, it does look, the newspapers are filled with stories about food prices right now. I read one in The Guardian yesterday about vegetable oil prices. So China exports 75% of the world's sunflower oil. Prices of sunflower oil are going through the roof. That's driving up, substitute oil prices. So I guess so we need to separate out two effects. First, what do you think about the impact on global food security issues? And secondly, how much of this is going to feed back into American food prices, do you think, if it's not already doing so?
Well, I think on the global issue, I think less inflation's the real thing. And the first order is the Ukraine-Russian war, because, as you agricultural economists know, 30% of world exports in wheat are from those two countries. So I think that's probably more the primary factor that's going to drive inflation, food inflation in the next year. In terms, though, of the other, is there kind of this general movement? I'm a little more optimistic, because the share of farmers complain about this all the time, but working favorably this time is the share of what's actually the food price that's actually accounted for by the farm gate price is really quite small. And because of that, even though they're going to potentially experience quite significant input prices, that won't necessarily spill into a large overall food price increase. So I'm a little, on that kind of a long run, I'm more optimistic. It's the war that who knows.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our time. And as I said, Alan Lyons' last question is, you know, a pretty substantive one. I think Krugman had a column in the Times last week that he wondered whether we're about to observe something that we observed just before the First World War, which was the end of the last, you know, that was the first phase of globalization in the late 19th century up to the First World War. I guess my question along those lines would have been, you know, how much longer does the supply chain problem have to continue for firms to really start seriously thinking about incurring the sunken fixed costs of reshoring? And I think that's kind of where we are with deglobalization right now. Is, in fact, if you go back and look at the financial crisis, right, and the pandemic, you know, the Economist calls it slowbalization. In other words, the hyperglobalization we observed up till 2008 has definitely slowed down. But I don't think we've entered a period of deglobalization yet. But again, I think that might be a story for another day, Mark. Maybe you and I should double team that one at some point.
Yeah, right. It's a good question. I mean,
it's a great question.
How it just stopped after 1913 is phenomenal. It would not have been expected then.
Yeah. So I would like to end today's webinar by thanking Mark very much for his really stimulating presentation. I'm sure there were many other things that you could have talked about. In fact, I'm pretty sure you had other things that you wanted to talk about, but you came up against a time constraint. And I'd like to thank everybody who asked a question and those who are attending. And again, Mark, kudos to you. There's a very nice comment here from Joe Gleam. Another really good presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed. Keep up the good work. So Mark, well done for your presentation, and thanks for the compliments from folks in the audience. We really appreciate getting your feedback.